The man whose job was finding missing people in Alaska took off from Anchorage and became one. Clarence Rhode ran the Federal Wildlife Service for the entire territory. His pilots flew the searches. When somebody vanished out in the country, the phone that rang was his. In August of 1958, his own aircraft went north into the Brooks Range with his son aboard and never came back. They launched the largest search in Alaska history. His own people, 250,000 square miles, flown again and again by the best pilots alive. They found nothing. 21 years later, 2 hikers walked up a mountainside and stopped. The plane was sitting there, inside the search grid, in the open. It had been there the whole time. That is Alaska. This state does not destroy the answers. It freezes them in plain sight, in country where nobody is standing, and then it waits us out. 20 years, 50 years, however long it takes for a family to stop being able to use the truth. 20 files from that freezer tonight. Ranked, counted down from 20 to 1. 3 of them will close while you watch. 1 with a verdict. 1 with a name after 37 years. 1 with a skull on a riverbank after half a century. And number 1 is not a murder. It is worse than a murder, and you will see why. This is Echo 7, log entry 20, in full, because so far I have only given you the ending. Late August, 1958. A Grumman goose, the workhorse amphibian of the North, lifts off with 3 men aboard. Clarence Rhode, Regional Director of the Federal Fish and Wildlife Service, the most experienced wildlife administrator in the territory. His son Jack, 22, a strong young man learning the family trade, and Stanley Fredrickson, an enforcement agent, a colleague and friend. The plan was routine by their standards. A patrol north through the Brooks Range country, checking on sheep hunters, touching remote lakes, the kind of trip Rhode had flown more times than his logbook could hold. The goose itself deserves a sentence because the aircraft is a character in this file. An amphibian, boat hull and wheels both, built to land on the lakes that serve as this state's runways, rugged, loud, beloved, and in 1958, middle-aged. Rhode flew it the way a rancher rides his own horse. The men aboard were not adventurers out of their depth. They were the depth. If you had asked anyone in the territory to name 3 men most likely to come home from that country, you might have gotten these 3 names. And somewhere in the high country, the trip stopped being routine, and nobody on Earth knew where. The search that followed has a texture you need to feel from the inside. This was not a family begging authorities for attention. This was the authorities searching for their own commander. Fish and wildlife planes flew until the season shut them down. The military lent aircraft. Bush pilots, the freelance knights of this state, flew grid after grid on their own fuel. The territory's newspapers ran it on the front page for weeks. The sweeps covered country the size of several states, some corridors flown over and over, and the high valleys of the eastern Brooks Range, the exact ground his flight plan implied, got the hardest looks of all. Alaska's calendar was the other adversary. The effort had perhaps 5 good weeks before the high country closed. Every commander of every September search in this state flies against the same clock. Termination dust on the peaks, the first storms sealing the passes, daylight collapsing by minutes per day, and the 1958 effort burned that whole window at maximum effort and bought nothing with it. When the season ended, everyone understood the search was not being suspended. It was being bequeathed to next summer and the summer after, and to whoever might someday stumble. Nothing. And in Alaska, hear what nothing means. It does not mean clues that led nowhere. It means the state took a 10,000-pound aircraft and 3 grown men and produced 0 physical objects across 2 decades. Insurance paid. Files closed administratively. Children grew up without fathers. The agency named an award after him, and the search had a second, crueler layer that the newspapers of the day only half said. The searchers were colleagues. Pilots who had flown 1,000 hours beside Rhode were now flying transects with his name on their kneeboards. His agency kept planes up past the point where the manual said stop, into the September weather, into the first snows that everyone understood were also a verdict. Because whatever the mountains had done, the winter was about to notarize it. Wives brought coffee to hangars. The territory's aviation community, which is to say the territory's nervous system, ran itself ragged for one of its own, and the effort's very size became part of the wound. If this search could fail, every pilot's family understood what that meant for the ordinary ones. There is also the son, and I do not want him to be a footnote in his own file. Jack Rhode was 22, and the trip was partly his apprenticeship, a father showing a son the country and the craft at the same time, the oldest kind of inheritance. Whatever happened on that mountainside happened to a family in a single instant, in a single airframe, and the mother and wife who waited in Anchorage waited on two names, and got neither for 21 years, and then got both on the same afternoon. The years between did what years do. The agency renamed things in his honor: a range, an award, the institutional grammar of grief. Aviation in the state modernized around the absence, better radios, better charts, and every improvement carried the same silent dedication, because half of this state's flight safety culture is a memorial to somebody, and the file itself sat in the drawer marked presumed, which is the drawer this night keeps returning to, the administrative word that means we have stopped, not we know. Then, in a 1979 summer, two hikers crossing a remote pass in the Brooks Range looked up at a mountainside and saw metal, the goose, broken against the high slope where weather, most likely, had shoved it in a moment that left no time for a radio call. The men were still with their aircraft. 21 years of Arctic weather had done astonishingly little. The wreck sat at altitude, in open country, visible, in a corridor the search had covered while the trail was hot. Picture the hiker's hour, because somebody finally stood in the vault. Two people, deep in country that sees no one, expecting nothing but the next pass, and the slope ahead resolves into geometry that does not belong, a tailplane, a hull, the walk toward it, the registration still legible, the understanding arriving in stages. This is old, this is intact, this is occupied, and then the last stage, the one that reframes 2 decades, we cannot be the first, and then the slow certainty that they were. They carried the news out on foot, and somewhere in Anchorage a phone rang in a family that had done its grieving in 1958 and had to learn, 21 years later, what the grief had been pointed at all along. Versions now, short ones, and none of them are comfortable. The sober one, which I sign, is that mountain flying kills fast and hides well, that a wreck against scree reads as scree from a search plane doing 140 knots in glare, and that every pilot in this state knows a story like this one. That version explains the crash completely. What it explains less completely is the arithmetic of the search, the sheer number of passes over that country by motivated experts, and this is where the file turns from a tragedy into tonight's thesis. The best search this territory ever mounted could not see a full-sized aircraft sitting still in searched country for 21 years. Now scale that fact down to a single human body and understand what every entry for the rest of tonight is up against. There is a technical name for the ghost in this file, and searchers say it quietly: probability of detection. Every sweep of every sector gets 1, a percentage, the honest admission that looking is not seeing, that a searcher's eye-crossing terrain registers a fraction of what the terrain holds, a fraction that drops with speed, glare, fatigue, snow cover, and hope. Sectors get signed off at percentages, never at certainty, and a corridor flown 5 times at 60% detection still holds a mathematical shadow where an entire aircraft can stand. The goose lived in that shadow for 21 years. Most of tonight's open files live there now, not outside the searched world, inside it, in the unsigned remainder of honest men's percentages. The question I want living in you all night is the one the hikers must have asked on that slope. How many times did an engine pass overhead? The wreck sat there through hundreds of search flights, thousands of later charter flights, decades of hunters glassing those ridges. Would your eyes have done better? At speed? In glare? With hope fading? How many eyes crossed that mountainside and filed it as rock? One administrative footnote, and it is the file's last cruelty. When the wreck was finally reached and the recovery done, the investigation could reconstruct the physics, the weather trap, the impact, But the 2 decades in between had converted every answer into a formality. No procedures changed that had not already changed. No one was rescued by the truth. The finding's entire yield was emotional. 3 families released from a question, and the state's first hard proof of the theorem this night is built on. Log the entry. Number 20. Souls on board. 3. Departed Anchorage, August 1958. Located 21 years late by 2 people who were not looking. Status recovered, too late to matter. Entry 19 drops us out of the mountains and into a small port town, and I will make you a dark promise on the way down. The mountains at least give reasons. Weather, granite, gravity. The next file has no mountain in it. It has a town of a few thousand people, 2 young women, 2 years apart, and 2 of the most ordinary walks anybody ever takes, and nothing about it has ever been explained. Seward, Alaska, a harbor town at the end of the road system, ringed by water and peaks, the kind of place where everybody's truck is known by its sound. The town's skill center drew young people from villages across the state, as Nome would draw Sonia a generation later. Teenagers leaving home for the first time into dormitories and cafeteria schedules. A whole small campus of first independence sitting at the edge of serious country. Keep that in mind for both halves of this entry, because both women were living inside institutions that noticed attendance, which is exactly why we know the vanishings to the day, and why the absence of everything else is so loud. In July of 1973, a young woman named Megan Emmerich, a student at the local skill center, walked away from her dormitory area on an ordinary evening and was never seen again. No witnessed struggle, no vehicle roaring off. A teenager in a small town, present at supper and erased by dark. The town did what small Alaska towns do. It searched itself. Shorelines, ravines, the edges of the icefield country behind town. Nothing surfaced. Megan was 17, learning a trade, living the first real independence a dormitory represents, and the record of her final evening is thin in the way records of unalarming evenings always are. Nobody photographs the ordinary. Her file holds a last sighting near the building, an assumption of routine, and then the assumption failing to hold, hour by hour, until somebody said the word missing out loud, and the town changed gears. The 1970s search had 1970s tools. Boats along the shore, volunteers through the brush, posters in the windows of a town where posters felt absurd. Everyone already knew. What it did not have was any of tonight's later machinery. No databases to seed, no cameras to pull, no cards to ping, and files born in that decade carry the handicap forever. Because the trail did not go cold, it was never recorded warm, and the file might have settled into the sad singular category that every state carries, except that Seward was not finished. 2 years later, in the summer of 1975, it happened again. Mary Thill, a young woman walking in the same small town, near the lake at the edge of it, gone, with the same completeness. 2 women. 1 town you can walk end to end in 20 minutes. 2 years. 0 physical evidence in either file, then or since. Mary was in her early 20s, and her last known ground was near the lagoon at the edge of town, a strip of water and path that half of Seward passes in a normal week. Between the 2 vanishings, the town had searched, grieved, theorized, and slowly exhaled, as towns must, and the second file arrived into that exhale like a fist. Fishermen rechecked the harbor. The skill center tightened its evening rules. Parents in a town with no stoplights started driving daughters 4 blocks. Seward learned, 2 years apart, that its size was not a defense, and there is a particular flavor of fear that only small towns know. The arithmetic that says whoever did this is not lost in a crowd, because there is no crowd. Whoever did this is known to us, or flies in. The name that shadows both files is one you will meet properly later tonight. A baker from Anchorage with a private plane and a habit of hunting human beings, who had connections to this coast, and whose active years wrap around these dates like a hand. Investigators looked at him hard for both women. He denied them, and one detail keeps these files honest instead of tidy. He confessed to 17 murders. He mapped his kills for the troopers from a helicopter. He gave up victims nobody had even connected to him. A man in that position has almost no reason left to lie about two more. Almost. And weigh the geography before you weigh the man. Seward in the 70s was one of his coasts. He fished it. He flew it. His radius of comfort covered it. And his method, as the confession laid it out, depended on exactly the kind of woman the boom years made invisible. Young, mobile, unlikely to be missed fast. Megan and Mary were not from that column. They were local, known, missed within hours. And that mismatch is the strongest card his deniers hold. His known victims vanished from a city that lost track of women. Seward missed its women immediately, and it changed nothing, which either means a different kind of predator, one whose advantage was not anonymity, but speed, or it means the country itself, the water and the ice-field terrain, took two women 2 years apart, in a coincidence the town has never been able to swallow. So Seward holds two open files that the state's most notorious predator refused to claim, which leaves the town with a mathematics problem nobody wants. Either he lied, in a confession where lying had stopped paying, or the town produced a second, quieter answer that has never once surfaced in 50 years. My read, signed, is that his denial is worth less than his geography, and that these two names belong on his map. And I will tell you plainly, that is a reading, not a record. And the record says open. Seward will return once more tonight, in the second half, wearing a different face, a crowd, a race, a mountain, and when it does, hold these two women in mind, because the town's two eras rhyme in a way I cannot explain, and will not pretend to. Some places in this state simply appear in the logbook more often than chance allows. And this harbor town, 3,000 people, wedged between mountains and water, owns 2 of tonight's 20 entries, which is either geography or coincidence, or the thing this channel never says with a straight face. The question for you is the one Seward has asked for half a century. In a town where every stranger is noticed, how do 2 women vanish 2 years apart with nobody noticing anything? Twice. Both files remain formally open with the state, and both women stand in the national databases, their descriptions frozen in the 70s, age-progressed sketches aging alongside the classmates who still live in town, and Seward's older generation still lowers its voice on the subject, half a century on, because in a town that small the files are not history, they are neighbors. Log it. Entry 19, 2 lines, 1 town. Megan Emmerich, 1973. Mary Thill, 1975. Status, both. Still posted. Entry 18, and steady yourself, because I promised you 3 closures tonight, and the first one is coming, and it will not comfort you. This file closes. It closes with a verdict, 101 years, and a law named after a 19-year-old. And the reason it will not comfort you is the uniform the killer was wearing, and the vehicle she climbed into, trusting it, because every one of us is trained from childhood to trust it. Nome, Alaska, August of 2003. If you only know Nome from the end of the Iditarod, understand the town first. A few thousand people on the edge of the Bering Sea, no road connecting it to anywhere. A place where young people from the surrounding villages come for work, for school money, for a first taste of town life. Sonia Ivanov was one of them, 19, from the village of Unalakleet, a basketball standout known across the whole region, working the admitting desk at the hospital, saving for college. She and her best friend and roommate walked everywhere in Nome because they had no car and because they felt safe. Hold that sentence. They felt safe. Understand also what Sonia was to the region, because the region will come back into this file at the verdict. Unalakleet is a village of several hundred on the Norton Sound coast, and its young people who move to Nome carry the village with them, the basketball tournaments where whole communities fly in to watch, the church, the web of cousins. Sonia was not anonymous in Nome. She was the opposite, a known girl from a known family, greeted by name on the street, employed at the region's hospital, exactly the person the statistics on missing Indigenous women say should never fit the profile, and who fit it anyway within a year of arriving. because the profile was never about the women. It was about who feels free to act, and against whom, and how sure they are that nobody will push. On the night of August 10th, the two friends were at a house gathering, board games, nothing harder. Around 1 in the morning, they parted on the street, the roommate turning toward a friend's place, Sonia walking on toward home through a light rain, a young woman on a familiar street, minutes from her own door. A witness would later describe what happened on that street, and it is the sentence this entire file balances on. A police cruiser pulled alongside the walking girl, a brief exchange through the window, and Sonia Ivanov got in. Of course she got in. It was raining. It was 1 in the morning. It was a police car. There is no version of that moment where a 19-year-old does the wrong thing by accepting, because accepting is what every safety lesson of her life had taught. She missed work. The roommate reported her, and a day later, a volunteer noticed fresh tire tracks turning down a dead-end gravel road outside town and followed them and found her. I will keep this at the record's level and no lower. She had been shot, close range, and the scene had been stripped in a way that read, to the investigators who processed it, as the work of someone who understood evidence, someone who knew what investigators look for, because looking for it was his job. Hold also on the volunteer who found her, because tonight keeps proving that the entire system turns on such people. A set of new tire marks turning down a road that goes nowhere, in a town where everyone knows which roads go nowhere, and instead of driving past, he turned down it. Then the town's officers, waiting days for state investigators to reach a roadless coast, did something that quietly honors them in the middle of a file that will shortly dishonor their department. They tarped the scene against the weather and stood guard over it in shifts, around the clock, protecting evidence that would eventually convict one of their own. The record should hold both facts about that small force forever, side by side. The town's police force was small enough to count on one hand, and the investigation that followed, taken over by the state troopers, became one of the most surreal in Alaska's history, because the evidence kept curving back toward one of the two officers on duty that night. It began with a tip about the cruiser, a small thing, the kind of detail that would have gone nowhere in a city. In Nome, it went straight to the roster, because the roster is short, and a short roster is the one advantage a tiny town has over a killer inside it. What came next was theater, and it is worth slowing down for, because it shows you the mind at work. Weeks after the murder, with the town boiling and the investigation circling, Patrol Car 321 vanished from the department's own lot and turned up abandoned with a typed note inside, a taunt, the killer supposedly mocking the police from outside their walls. Look elsewhere. You have the wrong idea. Investigators did look elsewhere, at the note itself, and the printer analysis brought it home to equipment the officer could reach. And inside the staged car sat Sonia's own identification, the one item that only her killer could still possess, donated to the theater by a man who couldn't resist a prop. He had, in effect, signed the Phantom's letter with her wallet. Then, as the walls kept closing, he reported himself attacked, wounded in circumstances investigators found unrecreatable, a final costume, the officer as victim. The investigator's line in the interview room, preserved in the record, says everything about how it read from the other side of the table. You would be dead, the trooper told him flatly. The man who shot at you does not exist, because the man who shot at you would not have missed. Investigators found a burn site out the coast road, and in the ash, the metal survivors of a young woman's outfit, grommets from her jeans, eyelets from her borrowed shoes, the underwire of a bra, 4 keys on a ring. He had burned everything that could speak, and the fire left exactly enough to testify. Matthew Owens, Nome police officer, was charged with her murder. And the town's ordeal was only beginning, because after the arrest, women began coming forward, one after another, with accounts of the same officer using the same cruiser and the same authority against them across his years on the force. Harassment, assault, threats delivered with the specific weight of a man who controls what gets written down, telling them, by their accounts, exactly what he believed, that nobody credits a complaint against a badge. Nome had to sit with the arithmetic of that. how long the pattern had run inside marked cars on its own streets, how many reports had died at the front desk of the department that employed him, and the town's answer to itself came at the first trial. The jury, drawn from a community where the defendant had worshipped, patrolled, and coached, could not agree to convict. A hung jury. A town unable to convict its own uniform. The state moved the second trial up the coast to jurors with no stake in the defendant, and they heard the same evidence and needed no phantom to explain it. Guilty, murder in the first degree, plus the tampering, plus the years the judge stacked to make the arithmetic of release meaningless. 101 years. What does it take for a town to convict its own protector? A second town, it turns out. He has spent the years since filing the appeals convicts file, conviction upheld, petitions denied, the machinery holding, and Nome has spent the same years doing the harder work, rebuilding the compact between a small town and its own police. A compact this file burned to the waterline, and in 2007, the Alaska legislature passed the Sonia Ivanoff Law, mandating 99 years for any peace officer who murders while on duty, a law that exists because a girl got into the car we tell every girl to get into, my read, and I sign it heavy. This is the single most important file in tonight's logbook, and it is not here for its darkness. It is here because it closed, and look at what closing required. A witness who happened to see the cruiser, a killer whose cover stories were clumsy, a state willing to prosecute a badge. Remove any one of those 3 coins from the machine, and Sonia Ivanoff is an open file tonight. Entry 18 on a list of riddles, and the internet is arguing about strangers and serial killers, while the answer drives a patrol route. Now carry that lens across every open entry that follows, and ask the question this file has earned the right to ask. How many of tonight's unsolved files are not unsolvable at all, but simply cases where the third coin never dropped? Her family turned the verdict into infrastructure, testifying for the law that bears her name, and the region turned her memory into scholarship funds and gymnasium banners, the way Norton Sound honors its own, and none of it, her father said in the era's interviews, was the thing they wanted, which was the girl, walking home, making it. Log the entry, and for once the stamp comes down hard. Entry 18, Sonia Ivanoff, 19, of Unalakleet. Status closed by a jury, over a uniform. And now the town itself gets an entry, because Nome was not done with this subject. Not before Sonia, and not after. Entry 17 has no single name on it. It has a pattern, a federal review, and a fight between the record and the families that is still going on tonight. For decades, a grim rhythm has run underneath this town. Visitors from the villages, in Nome for a court date, a clinic visit, a shopping run, a night out, who never make the flight home. Enough of them across enough years that the villages began sending their people to Nome with warnings, travel in pairs, call when you land, call when you leave. Enough that the FBI eventually came north and pulled a stack of the files for review, an extraordinary step for a town this size. The Bureau pulled roughly 24 files spanning the years of the pattern, deaths and disappearances of village travelers in and around the town, and worked them with the tools a federal review brings: re-interviews, record reconciliation, forensic second looks where remains existed. It was, whatever else is said tonight, more attention than most northern patterns ever receive, and the families who fought for it deserve the credit for its existence. Its official shape, when the review came back, was the sober one. Most of the cases, the Bureau concluded, resolved into the state's oldest killers: alcohol, exposure, the sea, the tundra at the town's edge that swallows a wanderer in fog. No phantom predator required. And the family's answer, which has never softened, is that the review was built on the town's own reports, that some of their people were healthy, sober, and expected home, and that a pattern this long, in a place this small, does not get to be a coincidence forever. Between those two positions sits everything this channel is about. The record says no connection. The families say no investigation. Both sentences can be true at once, and in Nome, for some files, I believe both are. Yet the review carried a footnote the families underline to this day. It examined the files that existed. Tonight has already shown you how this state treats people who never generate files. And village families will tell you, with names and dates, about calls that were logged as he probably missed his flight, about searches that started days late because an adult has a right to wander, about the specific grinding experience of reporting a missing loved one into a system that hears the report as a lifestyle. A pattern audit built on top of that intake system inherits every one of its blind spots. The Bureau reviewed the paperwork honestly. The question the families keep asking is who reviewed the paperwork that never got written? Walk the town for a second, because the geography is the whole argument. Nome is a grid of a few streets with the sea on one side and open tundra on the other, and the tundra begins where the last building ends. No fence, no tree line, no transition. Step out of a warm room at 2 in the morning, turn the wrong way, and within 4 minutes you are in country with nothing in it, in weather that does not negotiate. Now put a young person in that grid who does not live there, who came in on a flight from a village, whose ride fell through, whose phone is dead, who has been drinking because everyone in every town on Earth drinks on a Friday. The town does not need a predator to lose that person. It only needs the wrong 4 minutes. And the family's entire point, the one they have been making for 40 years, is that a place which can lose people that easily is also a place where losing people can be arranged, and that the state has never seriously tried to tell the two apart. Talk to the region's families, as reporters have for years, and the same scenes repeat with different names. The uncle who was sober, cheerful, and holding a return ticket filed as an accidental exposure with alcohol noted over the family's written objection. The niece who called from town saying she would be on the morning flight, and the file that opens 2 days later because the first call to police was received as she is an adult. The searches run by cousins with snow machines and borrowed fuel while the official machinery waited on jurisdiction. None of that convicts anyone of anything, and all of it explains why the word disputed does the heaviest lifting in this entry, because a review can be sincere and still be built on a foundation the families watched being poured wrong. I will not hand you a villain here, because the record does not contain one. I will hand you the number that will not sit still. Towns of this size elsewhere in America do not accumulate files like this. Either Nome's geography is simply that lethal, a real possibility on that raw coast, or somewhere in the churn of those decades, something else learned that this is a town where a certain kind of person can go missing and be filed under weather. Pick your reading. The families picked theirs a long time ago. Your question from this entry is a definitional one, and it will follow you through the rest of the book. When a review concludes that a pattern is only exposure and alcohol and water, in a place where exposure and alcohol and water are precisely how a person would be made to disappear, what exactly has been concluded? The families are not asking the state to believe in monsters. They are asking it to notice that the natural explanation and the perfect crime have identical paperwork here, and that only one of the two gets investigated. Log it. Entry 17. Souls, plural, count disputed. Status. The coldest stamp in the book. Resolved by climate. Disputed by the living. Now fly south, to a resort valley an hour from Anchorage, and to a file that proves the pattern travels. Everything you just heard about village travelers also happens, it turns out, to a seasoned Alaska woman at a music festival on a holiday weekend, surrounded by 10,000 witnesses. Entry 16, and it is the one that will make you look around at your own crowd. Girdwood sits in a green slot between mountains southeast of Anchorage, a ski town in winter, a festival town in summer. On the 4th of July weekend in 2012, the valley was full for the holiday, campgrounds packed, music going, the one weekend a year when this quiet place holds a small city's worth of people. Valerie Sifsoff, an Anchorage woman described by her family as tough, outdoorsy, and entirely at home in country like this, was there among them. She was built for this state. A commercial fishing background in the family, decades of Alaska summers. The kind of competence this whole logbook keeps insisting is no protection at all, because competence selects the very people who go where the witnesses are not. She was not a tourist who wandered past her depth. The valley she vanished from was the kind of ground she had spent a lifetime reading. At some point in those crowded days, Valerie stepped out of the frame. The reconstruction that reached the record has her last confirmed at a campground area along the road toward the old mine site, amid the churn of the holiday, and then simply absent in the way that only becomes visible in hindsight, when the weekend ends and everyone else goes home, and one person has not. Ask yourself, before we get to the search, the question her file quietly poses to every festival goer in America. If you stepped away from your campsite tonight, at a crowded event, who is your tripwire? Not who loves you, who would mechanically notice within hours that you had not come back, and would escalate past politeness. For most adults at most events, the honest inventory comes back thin, and thin inventories are exactly what this entry is made of. And understand what a Girdwood search actually means, because the word search does a lot of quiet lying in this state. The valley floor is a few square miles. The ground around it is not. Within 20 minutes of walking, you are in Devil's Club and alder so thick that two searchers 10 feet apart cannot see each other, on slopes that go from strolling to technical without warning, cut by glacier-fed water, running gray and fast and cold enough to end a strong swimmer in minutes. A ground team clears that terrain at a crawl, and clearing it means somebody physically put their body through every square meter, which nobody ever does, anywhere, which is why the searcher's honest word is not cleared. It is covered. What? Covered means we looked. It has never once meant we would have seen. The search worked outward from the campground. Dogs, ground teams, aircraft over the valley and the creek drainages, and it went on for days. Nothing came back. No gear, no confirmed sighting beyond the weekend, no resolution, and the file stands open with the state to this day. Her family has done what the families of the open files always end up doing in this state. They became the search's second act, returning to the valley across the years, working the brush lines and the creek banks on anniversaries, keeping her name in the regional news past the point where the news wants names, learning the exact bureaucratic weight of the phrase, still an open investigation, and their decade of asking has confirmed the Knight's running theorem from one more direction. Thousands of people saw that weekend. The number who saw her leave it remains 0. The versions run the way festival files always run, and I will label mine. Version 1 is the terrain, a wrong turn in the dark between campsites, the creek, the cold water doing the rest, and anyone who has stood next to a glacier-fed Alaska creek at night knows this version needs no embellishment. Version 2 is the crowd itself, because a festival weekend inverts the small town's one defense. Suddenly every face is a stranger, and nobody is noticed, and a predator's whole problem being remembered is solved for him by the calendar. Where I land, and I put my name on it, is simple. I distrust files where the disappearance chooses the one weekend of maximum anonymity. Terrain kills year-round. This valley took her on the 3 days a year when a stranger would be invisible. That is either coincidence, or it is the entire answer, and I sit with the second more than the first. And note what the festival did to the clock, because the clock is everything in a search. A woman camping alone among thousands is not missed at lights out. She is missed when the tents come down, and by the time absence hardened into alarm, the crowd that constituted the entire witness pool had scattered across the state and beyond, taking its unphotographed memories with it. Investigators were left to canvass a city that no longer existed. Whatever the valley knows, it learned during a weekend that dissolved on schedule, and that dissolution, more than any terrain feature, is why this file has stayed exactly where it fell. Your question here, and it applies far beyond Girdwood. Count the crowds you have stood in this year. In how many of them would your absence have been noticed before the crowd dissolved? The state's file on her carries the plain language of the unresolved, last known location, the campground corridor, circumstances undetermined. And her name surfaces in the periodic roundups of the region's open cases, one entry in the corridor of files, that the highway between Anchorage and the peninsula has quietly accumulated for 50 years, a corridor this channel has walked before and will walk again. Log the entry. Number 16, Valerie Sifsoff of Anchorage. Departed, a holiday crowd. Status, still posted, and the valley holds its festival every summer over her open file. Entry 15 is short, and it is a door, and I want you to walk through it slowly, because on the other side of it is the closure that hands a name back, the one I promised would arrive 37 years late. Anchorage, the 1970s into the early 80s. A boomtown swollen by pipeline money, full of cash, transients, and men. A downtown strip where young women, many of them dancers, many of them barely adults, worked clubs for the wages the boom paid. Across those years, women began to vanish off that strip, quietly, the way this state files things. Women whose lives were unstable enough that a sudden absence read, to the era's police blotters, as a bus ticket rather than a crime. Some were reported, some were not reported by anyone at all. Hold that. In this city, in those years, a 19-year-old could stop existing and generate zero paperwork. Picture the strip itself in those years. 4th Avenue, neon, snow packed to ice, cash economy, men off the slope with fat checks and 2 weeks to burn, clubs that filled and emptied on the shift schedules of the pipeline, and young women, most of them under 25, many of them fresh from villages or from the lower states, working those rooms because the money was real and the alternatives were not. They lived in rented rooms. They moved between clubs. They used names that were not their names. Every structural feature of that life, and I say this without a shred of judgment toward the women who lived it, functioned as an erasure kit for anyone who wanted to use it. And someone did. The era's machinery worked against them at intake. A dancer who missed a shift had quit. A young woman gone from a rented room had moved on. The boom was full of movers. Some employers reported, some shrugged, some profited from not asking, and the police blotter of a city drowning in pipeline chaos triaged accordingly. Files that did open often opened late and thin. A name, a club, a last shift. No photograph anyone could find. The women were adults, the era kept saying. Adults are allowed to leave. It is the sentence this channel has met in a dozen states, and nowhere did it cost more than here. We know now what was happening, because the man doing it eventually drew the state a map. A respectable Anchorage baker with a stutter, a family, and a private plane, who abducted these women, flew them into the wilderness across the inlet, and hunted them. 17 murders confessed. 12 bodies recovered along the flight lines he marked for the troopers. A name every true crime viewer already knows, so tonight, I am not telling his story. I am telling the ledgers. And the map itself had gaps he took to his grave, marks the troopers never matched to remains, ground that was flown and probed and gave up nothing. So the ledger runs in both directions at once, bodies without names and marks without bodies. And somewhere in the overlap between those two lists is a number of women that no arithmetic on earth can now recover. Because when the map was drawn and the digging was done, the state was left holding bodies with no names. Women recovered from his ground who matched no report, because no report was ever filed. The boomtown had churned so hard that its victims fell through it namelessly, and for decades the file said things like this: female, 17 to 23, buried as unknown. And the entry that follows is what happened when, 37 years later, somebody finally asked one of those unknowns who she was, and the answer came back. One sentence more, because it earns its place in a night about freezers. Those recovered women waited in the state's custody twice, once in the ground where a killer put them, and once in the system that could store them perfectly and name them not at all. The second wait, for some, is still running. Log entry 15, for all of them at once. The dancer's row. Souls uncounted. That is the entry's whole horror. Status recovered, unnamed, and hold the logbook open, because the next page fixes one of those two words. Only one. The state got very good, eventually, at recovering. Tonight you will watch it learn, decades late, how to name What it has never once managed, for this row, is the third verb, the one the row needed in real time, which was notice. Horseshoe Lake, north of Anchorage, sits an easy floatplane hop from the city's lakeside runways, which is precisely why it was chosen, by a man whose entire method was that this state's emptiness begins 10 minutes from its streets. In the mid-1980s, following the killer's own map, troopers recovered a young woman there. No identification, no matching report anywhere in the country. The examiner could say she was young, 17 to 23. The state buried her in the municipal cemetery under the only name the file could offer, a nickname taken from the water she was found beside, Horseshoe Harriet. And for 37 years, that was the entire biography. A man was in prison for killing her, in a plot bought by the public, under a name that was not hers. We knew everything about her death and nothing about her life. The line that always gets repeated about her case is that we know who killed her. We simply do not know who she was. Tonight, for this one, we get to finish the sentence differently. In 2014, the year her killer died in prison, the case was reopened and the remains exhumed for DNA. The first attempt, run against the national databases, came back empty because those databases match the missing, and no one had ever declared this woman missing. Think about what that null result actually said. Not unknown, unclaimed. Understand why the ordinary machinery had no chance, because the failure was structural, not lazy. Identification systems match a body against a report. That is the entire trick. Fingerprints to a card, DNA to a family sample, dental work to a chart somebody submitted, and every one of those roads begins at a missing persons report that for this woman did not exist. The state was holding one half of a handshake. For 37 years, the system did exactly what it was built to do, which was nothing, because nothing is what the design produces when the living side of the file is blank. Then came the technique that has been quietly emptying America's unnamed graves, genetic genealogy. A profile built and run, not against police files, but against family trees. Close matches surfaced. A tree was assembled by analysts working with the troopers' cold case unit. The tree pointed to a name, Robin Pelkey, born in 1963. A childhood split across states, family ties reaching down to Arkansas, then back north at 18 to live with her father, and then onto the streets of downtown Anchorage at exactly the wrong years to be a young woman on those streets. The records could trace her to late 1982. After that, nothing, and nobody had ever asked the state where she went. Relatives, found decades later, could sketch only the shape of a hard young life, a home that did not hold her, and then the streets of a boomtown at 19, the age Sonia Ivanov was when she walked home in the rain. Two 19-year-olds, 20 years apart, one file closed by a jury inside 3 years, one closed by a laboratory inside 4 decades, and the variable between them was never the killer. It was whether anyone with standing said the word missing to a government while it still mattered. Nobody said it for Robin. Her relatives, asked why, could only tell the troopers they did not know for certain. Her parents were dead. The answer died with them. And I want to be careful and human here, because families fracture for 100 reasons, and judging one from this distance is cheap. The system's failure is the point, not theirs. A 19-year-old should not need a functioning family to be counted as gone. Counting the gone is supposed to be the state's job, and for her, the state never got the paperwork that switches the counting on. Investigators found her relatives. One of them in Arkansas gave a sample, and in September of 2021, the kinship analysis came back, and a grave that had been lied to for 37 years got told the truth. Horseshoe Harriet was Robin Pelkey. She was 19. The troopers bought her a new headstone. When the troopers made the announcement, it carried a detail that tells you the institution understood what it was holding. The commissioner thanked, by roll, the generations of hands the file had passed through, the original detectives, the cold case unit, the analysts, 37 years of custody acknowledged in one paragraph, and the troopers, on their own initiative, replaced the anonymous marker over her grave. A state agency bought a headstone for a woman the state had buried nameless. And if you want tonight's thesis carved in granite, it is in that cemetery now, with her name on it. Sit with the sentence one more second before we move, because it is the strangest sentence in this book. For 37 years, a man sat in a prison cell convicted of murdering a woman whose name the state did not know. The conviction was sound. The victim was real. The grave was real. Everything about that file was solid, except the identity of the human being at the center of it, and the state, holding a killer, a body and a headstone, could not tell you who had died. Closure number 2, as promised, and feel exactly what kind of closure it is. No verdict changed. No family reunion. Her parents died without reporting her missing, and her relatives notified, asked for privacy, and who could blame them? The news arrived 37 years past its station. What closed was smaller, and I would argue, holier. A human being got her name back from a lake. The state of Alaska now has exactly one of that killer's recovered victims still unnamed, the very first one, and the same genealogists are working her file tonight. My read, signed. The dancer's row and this entry together form the quietest indictment in the logbook. The wilderness did not make these women vanish. Paperwork did. A city that did not file reports built the anonymity. The plane only used it. When people ask why Alaska eats so many, they picture mountains. Sometimes the mountain is a records desk in 1982 with nobody standing at it. And mark the scale of what her file proved, because the proof travels. The technique that named her requires no confession, no witness, no memory, only the preserved material and a distant cousin's curiosity about their own ancestry, which means every unnamed case in the state's freezers became, on the day her identification published, a solvable case in principle, separated from its answer by nothing but queue position and budget. The unnamed are no longer waiting on luck. They are waiting in line, and that is a different thing entirely, and the line is moving. How long is the line in this one state? Long enough that the analysts measure it in careers. Log the entry. Number 14, Robin Pelkey, 19. Recovered, 1984. Named, 2021. Status? And the flap turns after 37 years. Identified. Entry 13 keeps the same tool in our hands, the genealogy, and moves it from naming the dead to catching the living. Because 2 years before Robin Pelkey got her name back, this exact technique reached into a 26-year-old file from a university dormitory and pulled out a man nobody had ever looked at. April of 1993, Fairbanks. Sophie Sergey, 20, a young Yupik woman from the village of Pitkas Point, bright, studied, planning on marine biology, was visiting a friend at a University of Alaska Fairbanks dormitory, an ordinary overnight stay in a building full of students. She stepped out of her friend's room late that night for a cigarette. The next afternoon, she was found inside the building, and she had been murdered. And I am keeping every detail past that sentence out of tonight, because the record holds them, and you do not need them. 26 April thaws came and went in Fairbanks while that file sat. Her classmates graduated, married, aged. The dormitory was renovated. The detectives who caught the case retired, and some of them died, and each of them handed the folder forward with the same sentence. The evidence is good, we just have no one to compare it to. What you need is the shape of the investigation, because the shape is the story. A dormitory is a sealed jar, a finite list of residents, visitors, and keys, and she was found inside it. In a corridor students used daily, which told investigators the answer had held a key or been let in by someone who did. Everyone was looked at. The university cooperated. The town gave samples voluntarily in waves across the years, hundreds of men ruling themselves out, one cheek swab at a time. Physical evidence existed, good evidence, the kind that holds a profile, and the profile matched no one, not in the building, not in the town, not in the national offender databases, year after year for 2.5 decades. The file became Fairbanks' most famous open wound, a case where the answer's genetic signature sat in a freezer, complete, readable, and silent, because the man it described had never crossed into any database the state could search. Pitkas Point, Her village is a few dozen households on the Yukon Delta, and her murder traveled through the region the way stones travel through still water. She had come to town for a dental appointment, staying with a friend as village kids in the university orbit always do, and her death turned every such ordinary arrangement, statewide, into a parental fear. For 26 years, her mother kept her memory administered, calls to investigators, anniversary interviews, the labor of not letting a file settle, and troopers later said plainly that the case stayed workable, in part because the family never let the temperature drop. Then genealogy arrived, the same instrument you just watched name Robin Pelkey. In 2018, the profile went to the family tree analysts, and the tree that came back pointed away from Alaska entirely, to a man in Maine, a former student, briefly in that dormitory's orbit in 1993, who had left the state, built a quiet life, a healthcare career, a family, and had never been so much as questioned. An aunt's mail order DNA kit, taken for the gentlest reasons people take them, had placed his branch of the tree within reach of the analysts. Investigators confirmed the science with a direct sample. He was arrested in Maine in 2019, tried in Fairbanks, convicted, and sentenced to 75 years. The arrest, when it came, happened in a life that had no visible seam. Neighbors in Maine described an unremarkable man, employed, married, established, the fully rendered adult that 26 years builds. And the arithmetic of that is the entry's quiet horror. Every year of the file's silence was also a year of his ordinary mornings. Fairbanks flew him back. The trial put the science in front of a jury, tree, branch, sample, match, and the jury took the file that Alaska had kept at reading temperature for a quarter century and read it back to him as a verdict. 26 years. A man can build half a lifetime in 26 years, and he did, and the entire time, the freezer in Alaska held a molecule shaped exactly like him, waiting for the technology to read it aloud. That is this state in one image. The evidence never degraded. The question never aged. Only the tools had to catch up. And when they did, the answer stepped out of 1993, fully preserved. One more beat of respect before my read, for the instrument that actually broke this case, because it was not a policy or a program. It was an ordinary relative of the killer, somewhere in America, mailing saliva to a genealogy company to learn about their grandparents, with no idea they were also mailing the last free end of a 26-year-old thread. Every commercial DNA kit sold is a lottery ticket the unnamed and the unsolved hold jointly, and nobody who buys one is ever told, and tonight's logbook says they should be, because in 3 files out of 20, that lottery is the entire mechanism of justice. My read, signed, and it arrives as a question, aimed at every open entry left in tonight's logbook. Sophie's file wore the costume of the unexplainable for 26 years. It was never unexplainable. It was a solved case waiting for one relative, anywhere on a vast family tree, to spit in a tube. So when you meet the open files in the back half of tonight, hold this one against them and ask, which of these is truly beyond answering, and which is simply a name the freezer has not read aloud yet? At the sentencing, her family spoke the way this region speaks, without theater, about a daughter of the Delta and the 26 years. And the court imposed a term that means the file's subject will not walk free in any future that matters. And Pitka's Point, a village that had waited a generation, marked the verdict quietly, because verdicts do not return anyone. They only stop the question from being asked at every funeral. Log the entry. Number 13, Sophie Sergi, 20, of Pitka's Point. Status after 26 winters, closed by a family tree. Entry 12, and the logbook now takes its biggest single bite. 2 United States congressmen, the largest search in American history to that date, and an aircraft that has never been found, not in 50 years, not a rivet, and every conspiracy community in this country has been chewing on it since before most of you were born. Steady. We do this one clean. October 16th, 1972. A twin-engine Cessna lifts out of Anchorage, bound down the coast for Juneau, carrying 4 men. Hale Boggs of Louisiana, Majority Leader of the United States House of Representatives, one of the most powerful politicians alive, in the state to campaign for the man beside him, Nick Begich, Alaska's congressman, fighting a close race. An aide and a pilot complete the manifest. The route is the standard run, Anchorage to Juneau, mountains and water the entire way, weather reported rough through the passes, icing in the forecast. Portage Pass, the Chugach Coast, the long overwater legs across the Sound and the Gulf's fringe, a corridor every Alaska pilot knows and respects, because it stacks the state's 3 killers in sequence: terrain, icing, and water, cold enough to close a survival window in minutes. In good weather, it is one of the most beautiful flights on Earth. In October, it is a negotiation. The aircraft made its position calls early in the flight, and then the calls stopped, and the airplane carrying the 3rd-ranking figure in the House of Representatives flew off the edge of the record. The passenger manifest carried more political weight per seat than any small plane in American history. Boggs had stood feet from the machinery of the century, a Warren Commission member, a man on a first-name basis with presidents. Begich was fighting for his political life against a challenger, and Alaska politics being the contact sport it is, the flight itself was campaign logistics. A hop to a Juneau fundraiser squeezed into an October schedule. Weather be damned, because October is when elections are won. Every pilot listening tonight knows the phrase that lives in that sentence. Get there it is. The pressure of the calendar leaning on the throttle, and I sign nothing about this crew's choices. The record does not support blame, but the season and the stakes belong in the file, because they belong in every October file in this state. What followed had no precedent. The military threw itself at the coast, dozens of aircraft, weeks of sorties, sweeping the mountains and the sea lanes from first light to last. Coast Guard on the water. Civil Air Patrol and bush pilots stacked over the passes. 39 days of the most intensive search ever mounted for a missing aircraft in this country. The effort's scale produced its own folklore. The military's most classified reconnaissance assets were reportedly tasked over the route. Machines built to find missile silos asked to find a Cessna. Psychics rode in. Tipsters saw flares on every mountain, and the search command ran down all of it, because when the missing man is the House Majority Leader, no lead is too thin to log. The files of that October read like a state turning itself inside out. They found nothing. No wreckage, no oil, no raft, no signal. Both congressional seats were filled by the votes of men already dead. Boggs and Begich each won re-election in November while missing, a sentence American politics has never had to write since. The search ended. The seats were declared vacant. The country moved on. The 2 widows did not, and one of them turned the absence into a dynasty. Begich's name went back on Alaska ballots in the next generation and the one after. Sons and grandsons in the state's public life, a family that answered the ghost fleet the only way a family can, by refusing to leave the stage. And in Washington, the missing man's seat in the leadership passed onward. History flowed around the hole, and how does a nation file a wound it never got to see? It files it as folklore. The hole itself, the actual aircraft with 4 actual men, entered the permanent inventory of the state's unfinished business, where it remains, the highest-ranking entry in the entire American missing persons canon. The mountains did not give the aircraft back. 50 years of hunters, pilots, climbers, and melting ice have surfaced older wrecks all along that coast, and never this one, which leaves the file resting on the 2 honest pillars. Icing over water, most likely, the aircraft going into the sea, or a glacier in a way that left nothing on any surface a search could sweep. That version requires no villain and fits the weather. And against it, forever, the truth that this particular airplane carried a man from the Warren Commission and vanished totally. And total is the one thing air crashes almost never are. I sign the weather. I sign it while acknowledging that this file taught a generation of Americans to distrust the word coincidence, and that the distrust, whatever I think of it, changed the law. For the record, the theories had material to work with beyond the passenger list, an anonymous tip during the search, claiming the aircraft down and men alive, chased and never substantiated, and decades of second-hand claims that have never survived contact with the primary record. I have read the primary record. The weather was enough. The weather is almost always enough up here, which is exactly why anything else can hide behind it. And that sentence is tonight's thesis wearing a different coat. One part of this file nobody argues about. Out of those 39 empty days came a federal mandate, emergency locator transmitters, the automatic crash beacons now required on civil aircraft in this country. Every ELT that has ever screamed a downed plane's position to a satellite, every pilot pulled alive out of trees since the 70s, traces to this empty search. The 2 congressmen were never found, and finding people is easier in America because they were not. Alaska kept the plane and handed back a law. It is the closest thing this state has to an apology. Every few years, a glacier find or a sonar anomaly briefly reopens the story. Headlines flare, the families brace, and the anomaly resolves into an older wreck or a rock formation. And the file settles back into its unique category, the disappearance that changed federal law, elected 2 dead men, fed 50 years of theory, and has still never produced 1 gram of physical evidence. Log the entry. Number 12. Souls on board. 4. 2 of them United States congressmen. Status: half a century on. Never recovered. And the beacon in every small plane over your head tonight is this entry's headstone. And before we leave the sky, entry 11. Short and wide, because that Cessna is not an exception up here. It is a category, and the category's true size is the kind of number you should hear sitting down. Alaska flies the way other states drive. Most of its communities touch no road at all, so the small aircraft is the family car, the ambulance, the school bus, and the hearse, and the state holds more pilots per person than anywhere in the country. Now put that traffic over the terrain you have been hearing about all night. Mountain passes that manufacture their own weather. Coastlines where fog sits for weeks. Distances where a route between 2 towns crosses country no human being will stand on this decade. The arithmetic writes itself. Aircraft go missing here at a rate the rest of the country would call a crisis, and a portion of them are never found at all. Not found late. Never found. The state's aviation files hold dozens upon dozens of aircraft that took off, spoke to somebody, and left the record forever. A fleet of ghosts parked across the interior in pieces nobody has walked past yet. Hangars across the state keep the count in their own way. Ask around any bush strip, and you will collect the same inventory of stories. The mail plane that left in marginal light and entered legend. The hunting charter that made 1 radio call from a lake nobody can quite agree on. The ferry flight that crossed a pass in October and became a toast, absent friends, spoken at Christmas parties by men who then walk out and pre-flight in the dark. It is not fatalism. It is bookkeeping by people who love the work too much to lie about the ledger. Pilots up here talk about it with the flat honesty of people who have done the math on themselves. File the flight plan, carry the beacon, and understand that if the country decides to keep you, the search has maybe 3 good days before weather and probability start closing the book. The wreck from entry 20 sat visible on a slope through 21 years of daylight. Most of this fleet sits somewhere less visible than that, and the modern postscript belongs here, because the ghost fleet is why every new airframe and the satellite messenger clipped to a hunter's pack now carries the descendants of that beacon law from entry 12. Automatic position pings, breadcrumb tracks that families can watch live from a kitchen table. The pilots who use them have shrunk the category. The pilots who call them a leash keep it stocked. This state's oldest argument, between self-reliance and being findable, is still running on every gravel strip, and the ghost fleet is the self-reliant side's unpaid bill. A question to hold while we stay in the sky. The next time a bush plane crosses over you in this state, count the seconds it stays in sight. That window, 30 seconds of one witness's attention, is frequently the entire difference between a rescue file and an entry in tonight's logbook. Sit in the right seat for a minute, because this is the file type that most viewers can actually feel. You are an hour out of a village strip, low, under a ceiling that keeps dropping, in a valley that keeps narrowing, and the decision in front of you is the oldest one in northern flying. Turn around now and disappoint people who are waiting on medicine, or mail, or a body, or press on into a pass you have flown 50 times. Every pilot in this state has been in that seat. Almost all of them turned around. The ghost fleet is made of the ones who did not, plus a smaller, colder category, the ones who did everything right and met weather that did not care. A closing image for the fleet, from the finds that do occur. Once in a while, hunters or surveyors or a melt season turn up an airframe from the list, decades old, and the recoveries share a signature, the aircraft largely intact, the scene undisturbed, everything preserved at the moment of impact like a room sealed mid-sentence. And the investigators' reports read less like crash analysis than archaeology, the state handing over another shelf of its archive, decades past the last person who was actively looking. Log it. Entry 11. The Ghost Fleet. Souls in aggregate in the hundreds. Status: the aviation stamp nobody frames. Search suspended. Half-time. Stretch, refill whatever you are drinking. And if this book has already put someone in your mind, some name from your own north, hold them there, because the second half is built for them. Put the logbook down on the tailgate and count what the first half proved. A search commander found 21 years late, in country his own people swept. 2 women missing from one small town that a confessed monster refused to claim. A closure that required convicting the uniform every child is told to run toward. A town where the record says climate, and the families say, look harder. A festival valley that took a capable woman on the one weekend she would not be missed. A row of women erased by paperwork before any predator touched them, and one of them, after 37 years, getting her name back. A dormitory file that was never unanswerable, only a molecule waiting for a relative. 2 congressmen the sky ate whole, and the beacon law their empty search left behind. And a ghost fleet. Now notice the thing the first half never once contained, a witness. Not one of these files has an eyewitness to the moment itself. 10 entries, and the moment of vanishing was seen by nobody in every single one. In the rest of America, that would be a staggering coincidence. Here it is, the baseline, and it is the real answer to why this state is the cold case capital. And I want it said plainly at the halfway mark. Alaska doesn't hide people, especially well. Alaska is simply the one place that removes the witnesses in advance by the million acres, and then lets ordinary tragedy and ordinary evil operate unobserved. The freezer does not kill anyone. It just never testifies. Keep one hand on that sentence for the rest of the night. And keep your skepticism awake too, because a state where nothing testifies is also a state where every confident explanation, mine included, is running on fumes and physics, and I would rather hand you honest uncertainty than confident weather. One more count before we fly on, because the half also proved the counterweight, and I refuse to run a channel that hides it. 3 files in the first half moved. A verdict, a name, a tree, and all 3 moved for the same reason. Somebody kept the file warm. A roommate who reported within hours. A cold case unit that exhumed a grave. A mother who called every year for 26 years. The freezer holds whatever we abandon in it. The entire second half of tonight turns on that verb, second half, and it opens with the single strangest file in tonight's book, the one exception to everything I just said, because entry 10 is the man who vanished in front of thousands of witnesses, during a race, on a mountain with a crowd watching it. Seward again, the town from entry 19, and the 4th of July again, the date from entry 16, and if those echoes raise the hair on your arms, I am not going to talk you down. Every Independence Day, Seward runs the Mount Marathon race, one of the oldest mountain races in America. A straight, brutal shot from downtown to the top of the mountain behind town, and back, 3,000 feet up and down in an afternoon, watched by the biggest crowd Alaska assembles anywhere all year. The route is short, savage and lined with people, racers above, spectators below, the whole town watching one hill. In 2012, Michael LeMaitre, 66. An Anchorage man, fit, cheerful, thrilled to have finally gotten a race slot, went up that mountain with hundreds of other runners. Late in the day, near the top, he was still climbing, the last runner left on the course. Everyone ahead of him had turned. The mountain above him was empty, the mountain below him was full, and the officials at the checkpoint were beginning to think about their own descent. And the race matters to the file, so give it 30 seconds. Mount Marathon is not a trail run. It is a vertical tradition, a straight line up a face of loose rock and alder that locals train on all year, and it punishes the second half of the field brutally, because the mountain does not scale to fitness, it just waits. Michael had wanted into this race for years. The entry lottery is notoriously tight, and 2012 was the year his number came up at 66, and the family has said he treated the slot like a gift. The turnaround crew, by the accounts in the record, told him the checkpoint was closing, heard him decline a ride down in the way cheerful, stubborn men declined things, and started down, expecting him to round the turn behind them. He was above the cloud line that day, in worsening light, moving well. Somewhere in the next half hour, on a mountain with a town stapled to its base, the file begins. He never came off the mountain, not that evening, not ever. A 66-year-old man, on a marked race course, on a single mountain standing directly over a town, during the most watched afternoon of the Alaska year, went up in front of thousands of people and was subtracted. The search was immediate and enormous. The mountain is small by this state's standards, and it was covered. Gullies, cliff bands, the creek drainages, the snowfields, dogs and helicopters, and hundreds of volunteers who knew every rock. Racers joined it, men and women who had descended an hour earlier, retracing their own lines with headlamps. The town below kept its porch lights on like a harbor. Days, then weeks. Not a shoe, not a bib, nothing. On a hill you can see entirely from a parking lot. Think about the geometry once, and then let it disturb you properly. The entire mountain is smaller than many city parks. It stands directly above the roofs of a small harbor town. On the day he vanished, several thousand human beings were looking at it, deliberately, continuously, for hours, because looking at it was the entire point of the event. And it took him, in front of all of them, and gave back nothing. And the mountain kept holding its races, because towns must, and every July since, a few thousand people stand at the base of an open missing persons file and cheer, which is either resilience or forgetting, and Seward would tell you it is both, and that both are survival. The versions, signed where they are mine. Version 1, the mountain's edges, because Mount Marathon's descent routes brush cliff bands and steep chutes, and a tired 66-year-old in fading light, off the ideal line by 50 feet, has real ways to die there, and the waterfall gullies below have real ways to keep him, water working a body down into rock over years. That is the search consensus, and it may be the whole truth. Version 2 is the one the numbers keep alive, that the mountain was searched by people who knew those hazards intimately, that every previous casualty of that race and that hill had been found, usually fast, and that a complete erasure on a small, known, crowded mountain is not like the others. There is, as always, a third version whispered around files like this, the one where the mountain is only a stage and the answer left the area in a vehicle. Because a race day means open roads and 1,000 cars, and a man last seen above the clouds could, in the theory's arithmetic, have descended a back line unseen and met anything at the bottom. The record contains nothing to feed that version. No sighting, no vehicle, no motive, and I report it only because his family heard it for years and deserved better than internet plotting. Files this clean attract stories the way lights attract moths, and part of this channel's job is saying plainly that one has no fuel. My read, I sign version 1 with a shaking hand. The gullies, the water, the years. And I keep this file at entry 10, high in the book, because it is the cleanest demonstration in Alaska history that the witness problem is not about remoteness. Thousands of witnesses watched that mountain. Not one of them owned the 30 seconds that mattered. Witnesses do not prevent vanishings. They just prevent doubt. And here they could not even do that. The aftermath reshaped the race itself, and the reshaping is part of the record. The event tightened its cutoffs, added sweeps of the upper mountain, hardened its rookie requirements, changes written in the polite language of safety review that everyone in Seward can translate. Never again. Not like that. And his family pressed the state for years, petitioning for renewed searches, hiring independent teams, absorbing the particular cruelty of a file where the search area is finite, visible from a parking lot, and still silent. His wife said in interviews that the not knowing was its own weather, that she could stand in town and look up at the whole map of the question at once, every acre of it, and get nothing back. Very few files in this book let a family see the entire haystack from their car. This one does, daily, and it has never once helped. The question is his family's, and it has stood for over a decade. On a mountain that small, above a town that close, where does a grown man fit? In time, the state formally presumed his death, the paperwork of certainty without its substance, and his family has said the words that every family in this book eventually says, in one dialect or another: we could accept the mountain if the mountain would just confirm. Log the entry. Number 10. Michael Lemaitre, 66. Departed, mid-race, before the largest crowd in the state. Status still on the mountain, whatever that means. Entry 9. I promised a third closure, the strangest of the three, and it is time. This one closes a file that was never open, a man who vanished so completely that the vanishing itself went unwitnessed, unreported to any database that mattered, and unresolved for half a century, until a hunter picked up a skull on a riverbank and the freezer, at last, read a name aloud. The Porcupine River drained some of the emptiest country on this continent, the far northeast of the state, above the Arctic Circle, where the villages are tiny and the distances are absolute. Traffic on it, then and now, amounts to subsistence boats from the villages, the odd canoe expedition, hunters staging in by air, a river where a season's entire human presence would not fill a diner. In the mid-1970s, a young man from New York State named Gary Southerden went into that country on a hunting trip, the kind of expedition young men of that era made on savings and nerve, remote, self-reliant, gloriously out of contact by design. Being unreachable was the point, and somewhere in that country, out of contact became gone, and the terrible mechanics of his era did the rest, because a man who is supposed to be unreachable fails to alarm anyone for weeks, and a search that starts weeks late in country, that size is a gesture, not a search. The wilderness closed over him. Decades passed. His family aged around an absence with no shape. His family's decades deserve a paragraph because they are the file's true length. A son of New York State goes north in the mid-70s. The letters stop, the trip's return window closes, and the machinery available to a family in that era, phone calls to distant troopers, a notice in circulars, maybe a private inquiry if money allowed, runs out of road within months. There is no scene to visit. There is not even a state to stand in, just a river name on a map covering country the size of nations. The family carried it as such families carry things. Decades of birthdays with an asterisk, parents aging out of the weight, siblings inheriting it, the missing man frozen at 25 while everyone who loved him got old. In 1997, along the Porcupine, a skull was found on the riverbank, human, weathered, anonymous. The state logged it as it logs such findings. One more unnamed fragment in a place that collects them, and the skull went into the system and sat, exactly like the evidence in Sophie Sergei's file sat, complete and unreadable, for 25 more years. Then the same instrument you have now watched work twice tonight was pointed at it. A DNA profile, genetic genealogy, a family tree assembled from distant matches, and in 2022, the analysis came back and gave the riverbank skull a name, Gary Southerden. The hunting trip had ended within reach of the river, roughly half a century before, and investigators, reading what the remains offered, concluded the likeliest cause was the country's oldest one, a bear, 50 years participating in the record only as coordinates, and then a name, a family notified across half a century, a file opened and closed in nearly the same motion. The examiners working the remains, with the family's samples in hand, could go one step past the name, reading the bones' evidence toward the probable cause, the country's oldest resident, and even that conclusion arrived wrapped in the modesty honest forensics wears at 50 years' distance, likely, consistent with, probable. Read that conclusion carefully, because the state was careful with it. A bear does not sign anything. What the examiners had was a set of marks on old bone and half a century of silence around them, and the honest scientific verdict in such a case is a probability, not a story. Nobody will ever know the day, the hour, or the order of events on that riverbank. The state gave back exactly what it had preserved, a name and a strong suggestion, and kept the rest as its fee. Feel how different this closure is from the other two. Sonia's took a jury, Robin's took a headstone, Gary's took the full 50 years, and what it closed was not a case. There was barely ever a case. It closed a silence. And it proved tonight's thesis with a purity the other files only gesture at. The answer lay on a riverbank in the open for decades. The river did not hide it. The state simply had no way to ask it questions yet. Every unnamed fragment in Alaska's freezers tonight, and there are many, is this file on a different page of its calendar, an answer in storage, waiting for its technology, or its hiker, or its hunter with sharp eyes and a working radio. Signed opinion, and a short one. This is the most hopeful entry in the logbook, and I rank it high on purpose. The state that never gives answers turns out to be the state that never destroys them either. Cold works both ways. Somewhere in that trade, there is a kind of mercy, half a century late, and I will take late mercy over none, and I suspect Gary Southerton's family, whatever those phone calls were like in 2022, would tell you the same. His identification made national news for a day, one of those wire stories people read aloud to each other, half a century, imagine. And then the news cycle moved, and the deeper story sat unclaimed in the copy, which is that the identification machine had just reached backward across 50 years, with no missing persons report worth the name on the other end, and closed a file the system barely knew it had. The freezer does not require us to remember. It only requires us to eventually ask. Log the entry. Number 9. Gary Southerton of New York, missing since the mid-1970s. Status, and this flap turns after 50 years. Identified. Cause probable. File closed. Forget the wilderness for the next few minutes. The most reliable killer in Alaska is not the bear, and never has been. It is a distance of 400 yards, between a warm building and a warm building in January. And entry 8 is the one file tonight that some of you will personally walk into. First, feel the cold itself, because anyone watching from the lower states hears 40 below and files it as an inconvenience. At those temperatures, exposed skin fails in minutes. A stalled engine is an emergency, and the air itself will drop a healthy adult who stops moving, not eventually, promptly. The interior lives with that reality for months at a stretch, and lives well, because the entire culture is an adaptation to it. Block heaters and buddy checks and coats that cost a paycheck. The files in this entry are what happens in the seams of that adaptation, on the shortest walks, precisely because short walks are where nobody armors up. Every winter, in Fairbanks, in Anchorage, in Bethel, in Nome, in the villages, the same file gets written with different names. A person leaves one heated doorway for another, a bar toward home, a friend's place toward a parked car, a walk they have made hundreds of times, in cold that has gone from number to weapon, 30 below, 40 below, colder. Alcohol is often aboard, because gathering against the dark is what winter socializing is. The distance is nothing, a few blocks, and somewhere inside that nothing, a stumble, a shortcut, a moment of sitting down to rest, and the cold does its arithmetic, which at those temperatures is measured in minutes. Snow falls, or drifts, and the person is not merely dead, but gone, invisible 3 feet off a path. People walk daily, until the spring melt performs its annual dreaded unveiling, Ask anyone who has lived a decade in an interior town about breakup season, and watch their face do what faces do. Because the melt gives people back every year, and the town walks past the spot all winter. Even the resolved ones have taught the searchers a detail so strange, it belongs in tonight's book on its own merits. Hypothermia, in its final act, plays a trick the textbooks call paradoxical undressing. The dying brain misreads the cold as heat, and victims are recovered having shed coats, boots, shirts, folded sometimes, neatly, yards from the body. Every northern search team knows it, and every northern family confronted with it has to be talked through the same terrible first impression, that the scene looks staged, interfered with, wrong. It usually is not. It is the cold's signature, and it means that in this state, even the most natural death in the inventory comes dressed as a riddle, and anyone reading these files has to hold both facts at once. The trick is real, and the trick is also the perfect camouflage for anything that wanted to look like the trick. Some of these files resolve exactly that way, months late, feet from safety. And a residue does not resolve at all, doorways to doorways with no melt answer ever. And those files inherit every question this night has taught you: the missing witness, the assumed stumble that nobody saw, the possibility, quiet and unprovable, that not every short walk ends by accident. Cold is the perfect cover story, precisely because it is almost always the true one. If something else ever wanted to operate in an interior winter, it would need to invent nothing. The season comes with its own explanation pre-installed. Do this walk with me, because it is the most likely way that anyone listening to this in the North actually enters a file like the ones in this book. It is 1:20. The bar is warm and loud, and you are fine, and home is 400 yards, and you have made that walk since you were 19. Outside, the air takes the water out of your eyes in the first breath. You cut the corner, across the lot, over the berm the plow built, because it saves you 90 seconds. The berm is higher than it looks. You go down on the far side, into the soft snow in the ditch, and it does not hurt. And the snow is oddly warm, and it is genuinely easier to sit for a second than to get up. Nobody is looking for you. Nobody will look for you until noon tomorrow, and even then, they will assume you slept at a friend's. You are 11 feet from a road that 100 cars will use before dawn, and every one of them will drive past a berm with nothing visible behind it. In April, when the snow drops, someone walking a dog will find you. That is the file. There is no monster in it, no wilderness, no 3-day search. There is a shortcut, a berm and a season, and it happens somewhere in this state every single winter. And the only reason it is not the most famous killer in Alaska is that it is too ordinary to make headlines. Interior towns have grown rituals around this file type, much as coastal towns ritualized the sea. The volunteer sweeps after a big cold snap, checking the routes between the bars and the neighborhoods. The informal registries, who walks, who lives alone, whose porch lights schedule the neighbors quietly track. The spring anxieties said out loud in every diner as the snowbanks drop. A wariness about ditches and culverts that outsiders mistake for morbidity and locals know is just the calendar. None of it is official. All of it works better than most official things, and it is the closest living relative of the practical minute this logbook will end on. Now my version, and I want it said carefully. I believe the cold takes nearly all of them, and I believe nearly is one of the heaviest words I will use tonight, and I believe no one, including me, can tell you which files sit inside that gap, because the gap is exactly where proof does not survive. The question, and it is a practical one for every northern viewer: who walks your people home? Not watches them leave, walks them. The 400 yards is the whole battlefield, and each spring's returns close last winter's files with a bitterness all their own, because nearly every recovery happens within sight of a structure, a fence line, a porch light, the distances an insult. And every northern town that has stood at such a recovery makes the same vow about walking people home, and keeps it for about a year. And I say that without judgment, because vigilance has a half-life everywhere on Earth, and the cold's entire strategy is to outlast it. Log it. Entry 8. The doorstep files. Souls every winter, plural. Status. Most recovered at breakup. Some overdue, indefinitely. Water next. Everything you have heard about the land tonight is more true at sea, and this state has more coastline than the entire rest of the country combined, and the sea doesn't do breakup season. Land gives people back in April. Entry 7 is about the country that never gives anyone back at all. Southeast Alaska and the Gulf Coast run on boats as surely as the interior runs on planes. Ferries stitching towns together. Fishing fleets working some of the deadliest commercial water on Earth. Harbors full of liveaboards and seasonal workers. Commercial fishing has spent decades as the deadliest ordinary job in America, and this state's fleet works the worst of its water. And the water writes two kinds of entries. The loud kind, the boat that goes down with a mayday, names known, the fleet mourning, the kind of loss this coast has ritualized because it must, and the quiet kind, which belongs in tonight's book. The deckhand who is aboard at the evening meal and absent at the morning count, somewhere in 100 miles of night wake. The passenger who boards a ferry at one port, on camera, and does not walk off at the next, with nothing on the vessel out of place. The harbor liveaboard whose skiff is found circling, or tied, or gone, and whose file consists of a dock and a question. Nobody sees these. There is no scene. The vessel arrives intact, and a person has simply been subtracted somewhere along a moving line drawn across black water, and the search area is a mathematical abstraction by the time anyone draws it, and stand on the deck for a moment, at 3 in the morning, because the physics deserve respect. A working vessel at night is a moving machine in the dark, wet steel, a rail at hip height, engine noise that swallows a voice completely, and a wake behind you that closes in seconds. Go over the side and the water takes your breath in the first instant. Your hands stop working inside 2 minutes, and the vessel you came off is a light on the horizon before you finish understanding what has happened. Nobody hears a shout over the engines. There is nothing to grab, nothing to leave behind, no scene to preserve, no ground to search. It is the nearest thing this planet has to a delete key, and it operates identically whether you slipped or whether you did not. Ferry files deserve their own sentence inside this entry, because the state's marine highway is exactly what its name says, a road with the same expectation of mundane safety, and a vessel that arrives with one fewer passenger than it loaded presence investigators with a crime scene the size of a county that was also moving at 15 knots all night, washed continuously by wind and salt water, populated by strangers who disembark and scatter at the next port. Interviews happen days later, in other towns. Where does a witness even stand on a route like that? The camera coverage ends at the car deck. The file opens with a boarding record and closes, when it closes, with an actuarial phrase. The industry's safety revolution, survival suits, mandated drills, stability rules, has dragged the loss rate down year over year, a genuine achievement written in regulation and blood. The revolution's fine print is that it mostly fixed the loud entries, the sinkings, the capsizes, the events with witnesses and radios. The quiet entries, one person and a rail and the night, resist every regulation ever drafted, because you cannot legislate a witness into existence. Officially, these resolve to the sea's honest hazards, rails and fatigue and alcohol and hypothermic water that takes even strong swimmers in minutes. Unofficially, every coast cop and every old deckhand will tell you the same quiet thing, that a moving vessel at night is the single cleanest place in the world for a person to be helped over a rail, and that the sea will grade every such file identically. No witness, no scene, no body. Accident by default. I sign the sea for most. I decline to sign it for all, and so does anyone who has ever worked those decks. And none of us can take it further than that sentence, which is the whole point of the entry. The families of the rail files occupy the hardest legal ground in this book. Death without evidence, estates frozen, insurers waiting, the courts eventually issuing presumptions that read like weather reports. And more than one such family has stood at a dock years later watching a vessel arrive, the same run, the same railing, open to the public, the scene of the unprovable, In service. Daily. Log it. Entry 7. The rail files. Status. In the water's own handwriting. Lost overboard. Presumed. And presumed is doing more work in that stamp than any word in this book. One entry tonight is owed rather than chosen, and I will keep it plain, because this channel gave the subject a full film already, and the numbers have not improved since. Number 6. Alaska Native people are the smallest slice of this state's population and the largest slice of its missing persons files, year after year, by margins that would be a national scandal if the nation looked. Indigenous women in this state go missing and die violently, at rates several times their share of the census. Villages hold funerals for questions, and the files stack up in a system where the first responders may be a day of weather away, and the jurisdiction may be a negotiation. Sonia Ivanov's file, the one that closed, is the exception that measures the rule, and her law exists because her family and her region refuse to let the file be ordinary. Most families in this row never get the witness, the tip, or the trial. They get anniversaries. I am not reopening the full ledger tonight. We built it a film of its own. Every name in it stands, and the standing row from that film has only lengthened. What has changed since, slightly, is the machinery. Task forces stood up, federal attention that arrives in cycles, cold case units that now carry the genealogy tools you have watched work 3 times tonight, and the family's organizations, which were always the real infrastructure, walking searches and keeping databases that the state took years to match. Whether the machinery holds through the next budget cycle is a question the families answer from experience, and their answer is why the organizations never stand down. What belongs in this logbook is the shape. When a state's missing persons system works worst for the people who have lived in it longest, the freezer is not neutral. It has a setting, and somebody chose it. Decades of somebodies, in budget lines and patrol maps, and the quiet math of which files get a second detective. The wilderness gets blamed for a great deal in this state that was decided in offices, and the mechanics of the failure are not mysterious to anybody who has worked them. A village has no local police force, only a public safety officer, sometimes unarmed, sometimes not there. The nearest trooper post can be a flight and a weather delay away, which means the first responder to a possible homicide might arrive 3 days later, after breakup, after a thaw, after a family, out of love and desperation, has already searched the ground themselves. Jurisdiction between tribal, state, and federal authority has to be sorted before certain files can even move, and every one of those delays is a physical thing, measured in evidence that stops existing while people wait for an airplane. The wilderness gets the blame. The schedule did the damage. If you carry one number out of this entry, carry the ratio, not the raw count. In file after file, the gap between how fast this state mobilizes for a lost hunter with an aircraft and how slowly it has historically mobilized for a village woman missing from a regional hub is the most honest measurement of the machine ever taken. And closing that gap costs less than one search plane costs, and the families have been saying so, politely, in hearing rooms for 30 years. Log the entry. Number 6. The row with the most names and the fewest verdicts. Status, active, in every sense of the word. Now let the ice speak for itself. An hour from Anchorage, there is a place where the state's biggest freezer has been slowly, deliberately handing back its contents, year after year, on a schedule of its own choosing, and Entry 5 is the only file tonight where the state is winning, which turns out to be harder to sit with than any of the grief above it. In 1952, a military transport with 52 men aboard flew into a mountain east of Anchorage in weather, a known crash, a located crash, and then an unreachable one. And within days, the glacier below the impact took the wreck and the men and closed over them, and for 60 years, that was that. A grave with a slow current. And then, in 2012, a helicopter crew training over Colony Glacier spotted debris on the ice, and the mountain's ledger reopened, because the glacier, having carried the site inside itself for 6 decades, had finally conveyed it to the melt zone at its foot, and begun laying the contents out on the surface. Metal, equipment, the men. The work itself is like nothing else in the world. Crews land on the live glacier in the brief window when the surface is bare enough to read. Walk lines across the melt face. Flag what the ice has surrendered. Fragments of airframe, boots, dog tags, the men, and lift it all off before the season closes the archive again. 60 years inside a moving glacier grinds and scatters, so the identifications happen molecule by molecule in laboratories, matched against family samples gathered from nieces and grandsons who never met the men they are giving blood for, and who signs up for that duty, summer after summer, on a surface that creaks underfoot. The same kind of people this book keeps finding everywhere. Since that summer, the teams have gone back every year in a recovery operation with no parallel anywhere. And season by season, names have come off the list, identifications made. Families who buried a telegram in 1952, burying a man instead, 70 years late. The glacier sets the pace. Some years it gives generously, some years almost nothing. The teams go back regardless, because the ice has made its intentions plain. It is giving them back, all of them, in its own order, on its own decade plan. And there is a detail from that ice that stays with everyone who hears it. The glacier gives back the men, and with them, their whole world, unchanged. A survival kit, a life vest, a fountain pen, a wallet with paper still legible in it, a wristwatch, objects handled by young men in 1952 and untouched by any hand since, arriving at the surface with the shine still on them. This state has produced no clearer statement of what it is. Everything you lost is still here, in perfect condition, and you will get it back when the ice decides. Yet the family's side of the glacier deserves its sentence. For 60 years, these were names on a wall for the families. A telegram, a memorial service around an empty rectangle, the specific incompleteness that military loss carries when the aircraft is unreachable. Then, starting in 2012, phones began ringing in a slow annual season. A niece in her 70s learning that an uncle who existed as one photograph on a hallway wall was coming home. Funerals held with honors, 2 generations late. Headstones replacing markers. Some families have received their man in pieces across multiple summers, the glacier delivering on installment, and they return to the gravesides each time because you finish what the ice starts. Understand what this entry does to tonight's thesis, because it is the thesis, animated. Every metaphor I have used, the freezer, the state that stores answers, here it is literal. A river of ice functioning as an archive with a delivery schedule, proof that in Alaska, the distance between missing and found can be 60 years of patience with nothing unexplained in it. The men were never lost. They were in transit. What I hold here is barely an opinion. It is a question, and I hold it hard. Colony Glacier is the ice we happen to watch, because we know what it carries. This state has 100,000 glaciers. What is the rest of the inventory, moving toward daylight at a foot a day, with no one assigned to meet it? The operation has a projected end date, measured in decades, keyed to the glacier's own schedule. And the crews speak about the work with a reverence that leaks through even official statements, because it is the rarest job in the entire recovery field. A search with a guaranteed positive result, run against an adversary that has agreed, at last, to give everything back. Log the entry. Number 5. 52 souls. Boarding in 1952. Arriving now. Status. The strangest stamp in the logbook. In delivery. I resisted the next entry, and I will tell you why before I read it. It has no scene, no name, and no date, and it outdisturbs almost everything above it, because it is the bookkeeping entry, the one where we ask how big tonight's logbook actually is, and discover that nobody on Earth can answer, and that the impossibility of answering is itself the finding. Number 4. Take the entry as one image first, and then a question you have never been asked. How would anyone know if you were gone? Not your family, not tonight. But in the terms this entry works with, is there a system anywhere, employer, landlord, government, community, that would generate a formal record of your absence within a month if every person who loved you were removed from the picture. For most adults in this state, seasonal, transient, off-grid by choice or by circumstance, the answer is no, and that no is the raw material of entry 4. Somewhere in this state tonight there is a filing cabinet, real, physical, in a trooper detachment, holding open missing persons files. And the honest label for that cabinet is not everyone we have lost. It is everyone somebody made us write down. Alaska, year after year, posts the highest rate of missing persons reports in the United States, roughly double the national figure per capita, and worse in the worst years. Sit with the doubling for a second, then start subtracting the comfort. That number counts reports, and tonight has already shown you, twice, what this state does with people nobody reports. Robin Pelkey stood in a grave for 37 years without ever being counted as missing. Gary Southerden spent decades as a set of coordinates, so the true number sits above the official one at an offset nobody can compute. Then subtract again, because the state's clearance machinery leans on categories: presumed drowned, presumed exposure, search suspended, stamps that close a file administratively while answering nothing, and each of those stamps quietly moves a person from the column called unanswered to the column called weather. And layer the state's churn on top because Alaska is a place people come to precisely in order to thin their paperwork. Seasonal workers on fish processors and slime lines who exist in a company's records for one summer. Cabin dwellers who opted out of the grid as a life philosophy. Travelers between hostels and harvests. An entire demographic whose absence has no natural alarm attached. When a person like that stops appearing, the question is not who reports it. The question is who would ever know, and the state's honest answer for some unknowable number each decade is no one, ever. Run the honest arithmetic, and the finding is this. The cold case capital of America does not know its own case count, not within hundreds, and the error term is made of exactly the people this night has been about. The unreported, the unwitnessed, the administratively resolved. Other states have missing persons lists. This state has a missing persons estimate, and everyone in the system knows it, and almost no one says it into a camera. And I just did, and you should ask yourself why the sentence is so rare. Because it is not, because it is false. My read, signed. The undercount is not a scandal of intent. Nobody designed it. It is a scandal of shrug, assembled from a century of reasonable individual decisions. He is an adult. She probably left. The season ended, and so did the workforce, and the assembly is now load-bearing. This state could not publish an honest count if ordered to, and the impossibility, which nobody chose and nobody owns, is entry 4, and I rank it above murders because murders subtract one person, and this subtracts the knowing itself. Log the entry. Number 4, souls unknown, and the word unknown is the entry. Status: off the books. The logbook now does what this state's files always eventually do. It curves back on the searchers themselves. Entry 3. Everyone who looks for the missing in Alaska does the looking inside the same machine that took them. There is no safe vantage point in this state. No ridge you can watch from. No aircraft the weather respects because of what is painted on the tail. Search pilots fly the same passes. Ground teams cross the same rivers. And this state's history is stitched with the files nobody likes to open. The searchers who became entries, aircraft lost while hunting for aircraft, volunteers who went into the country after a stranger and stayed, troopers and guardsmen whose names ended up on the same memorial walls as the people they flew for. Clarence Rhode, entry 20, the man this whole night opened on, is the founding member of the category, the search commander the searches could not find. The state asks its best people to fly into its worst country on its hardest days, and the state does not grade on a curve, and every search season, somewhere up here, a family of a rescuer waits out the same silence as the family of the missing. The state's search and rescue community carries its own memorial arithmetic, aircraft lost on active searches across the decades, hoist crews and swimmers lost to the water they were pulling strangers from. and a tradition, quiet and universal, that when a rescuer's own file opens, everything flies, weather minimums bend, and the country gets shown what a maximum effort truly looks like. One last time, for one of its own. Sometimes even that is not enough, and those files hurt the system in a place civilians never see. I keep this entry short because it deserves quiet more than length. When you hear that a search was suspended, hear the full sentence underneath. Suspended means the people risking their own entries in this logbook were pulled back before the country could take one of them too. And that call, made by some commander at a fuel-stained folding table, is the heaviest signature in the state. And what did the searchers themselves take from his file? Rhode's agency, after 1958, kept flying the same country with his name on the award for doing it well, which is the whole culture in one fact. The risk acknowledged, absorbed, and reboarded every season by people who have read this logbook closer than anyone and go anyway. Log it. Entry 3. The searcher's own page. Status. On call. Perpetually. Nearly home. Entry 2 is the logbook looking at itself, and it is the shortest, emptiest, worst entry in the book. The blank rows. Pull up the National Missing Persons database tonight and filter it for this state, and read what fills the screen. Rows upon rows where the fields themselves surrender. Last seen. Date approximate. Location. Region only. Circumstances. Unknown. Entire entries built from a single fact. A person existed, and then a paperwork shrug. Files with no narrative at all, because the vanishing predated the questions or outran them. Every state has thin files. This state has files that are functionally empty. Human beings reduced to a name, a year, and a blank map. And the blankness is not sloppiness. It is an honest transcript of how completely a person can leave the record here. The unidentified section runs the same way in reverse. Remains with no names stacked against names with no remains. Two lists that are, some unknowable percentage of the time, the same list, waiting for the technology or the funding or the hiker to introduce them, the way Gary Sutherland's 2.5 files were finally introduced after 50 years. You can do this tonight, on your own phone, for free, and I would encourage it, because the numbers stop being numbers about 4 rows in. Read 3 of them out loud, and hear what the state is confessing. Last seen, approximate, spring. Location, general region. Circumstances, unknown. That is a human life summarized by an admission of ignorance in every field, filed and left, and nobody involved was negligent. The fields are blank because nobody ever knew, because nobody was there. Behind a fraction of those blank rows, there are still kitchens where someone keeps a folder, printouts, a laminated flyer, the sediment of an unanswered decade, and behind another fraction, there is nobody at all. The file's only advocate being the database itself, a server holding a name against the day a match arrives. The genealogy wave you watch tonight is working through these rows at the speed of funding, which is to say slowly, and every technician in that field says the same thing. The science is no longer the bottleneck. The bottleneck is attention, measured in dollars and staff hours, rationed across 10,000 blanks. Last signed opinion of the night, and then the finale. The scariest thing in this state's records is not any single story. It is the fields left blank, at scale, because each blank is a place where the machinery of knowing simply never engaged. And the freezer's true inventory lives in those blanks. And tonight's 20 entries are the ones with enough surviving detail to tell. The logbook you have been listening to is the legible fraction. If you have ever wondered what you would say to a missing persons database, the databases have an answer, and it is not rhetorical. They accept family reference samples. They accept information on decades-old cases. They are staffed by people who consider a 40-year late report a good day, and every technician in the field repeats the same sentence to every hesitant family. It is never too late, and tonight proved them right 3 separate times. Log it. Entry 2. The blank rows. Souls. A number with no edges. Status. The stamp that should keep you up tonight. Awaiting narrative. And now, Entry 1. The most disturbing file in Alaska, as ranked by me, and you have been arguing with that ranking in your head since the countdown started. and I am holding my ground. It is not a murder. I told you at the top it was worse than a murder, and the file is one you already know because entry 1 is entry 20. Read a second time, with everything the night has taught you. Go back to that mountainside in the Brooks Range, and this time, do not look at the aircraft. Look outward. Down the valley the search planes flew, over and over, at 140 knots, over an answer sitting in the open. That is the most disturbing thing in this state, and it is entry 1. When Alaska finally gives an answer back, it gives it back from a place we already looked. Rhode's plane sat inside the searched corridors. Robin Pelkey lay 37 years in a grave the state itself dug. Gary Southerton's skull sat on a riverbank hunter's cross every season, then sat 25 more years inside an evidence system. The glacier is handing back 52 men onto ice that helicopters fly over daily. Not one of those answers was ever hidden. Everyone was in reach, in plain sight, or already in our own custody, while the question destroyed the living. Worse than a murder, because a murder has an author. This one has none. Alaska's weapon is not concealment. It is the absence of witnesses, at a scale that turns plain sight into a vault, and the vault has no lock on it at all. It only has distance from your eyes. So, hear the last status line. The answers are here. They have always been here. And somewhere out there tonight, on a slope, a bank, a shelf of ice, one of tonight's open files is lying in the open air, keeping perfectly, waiting for a pair of boots that has not crossed that 100 feet of the planet yet. Log the entry. Number 1. Souls on board. Every name in this book. Status in plain sight, unvisited. Say them once, and then go. Clarence, Jack, and Stanley. Megan and Mary. Sonia. Valerie. Robin. Sophie. Hale and Nick. Michael. Gary. The 52 men of the glacier. And the blank rows, which outnumber every name I just read. 2 questions, and I am leaving them with you, because Alaska never answered them for me. If the truth was in plain sight in every file we closed tonight, what exactly is standing between the open files and their answers? And if it is not distance, and it is not the cold, and it is not the bears, then what is left except attention, the one resource this state has never had, and the one resource you actually control? So be the witness, file the plan, report the missing, even when the form feels like a betrayal. Walk your people the 400 yards. Look twice at the slope that reads as rock. Every closure tonight, every single one, came from one person paying attention slightly past the point of reasonableness. 2 hikers, 1 volunteer who followed tire tracks, 1 aunt with a mail order kit. Subscribe if this logbook should stay open, because the freezer is deep, and some of tonight's open entries will move while we are watching. The logbook is closing now. The last page is blank. The date on it is tomorrow, and the coordinates are wherever you fly, drive, race, fish, walk home, or step 50 feet off the line. Alaska keeps the answers. Somebody has to come get them.